No, the old man whispered as he stepped through the towering glass doors. No one outside Sicily says it that way anymore. The sentence drifted across the ballroom so softly that only the people closest to him heard it. Yet somehow it silenced a room filled with the low murmur of billion-dollar conversations, crystal glasses, and a jazz trio playing beneath shimmering chandeliers. Every executive turned instinctively toward the entrance of the Grand Astoria Hotel in Manhattan, where Ethan Caldwell, the 38-year-old billionaire CEO of Caldwell Dynamics, welcomed investors from across Europe for what financial reporters were already calling the most important private business dinner of the year. Cameras flashed. Luxury watches caught the warm golden light. Waiters moved like shadows between tables dressed in white linen and polished silver. Everything had been rehearsed down to the smallest detail, except for one quiet waitress no one had bothered to notice. Naomi Carter kept her eyes lowered as she adjusted a water glass at the edge of the head table. At 24, she looked exactly like the kind of employee powerful people forgot 5 seconds after placing an order. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, her apron spotless, her movements calm and almost invisible. She spoke only when necessary, smiled politely, and carried herself with the quiet discipline that came from years of working twice as hard to earn half the recognition. Around her, conversations floated through the room without ever including her. Investors debated markets. Attorneys whispered about acquisitions. One guest joked that the evening needed an interpreter because Ethan's father refused to abandon his old Sicilian habits whenever he became emotional. Laughter circled the table. Good luck finding anyone who understands him. Another man chuckled. That dialect disappeared with his generation. Ethan smiled politely, but said nothing. He loved his father, Antonio Caldwell. But even he struggled to follow the older man whenever memories pulled him back to the tiny Sicilian village where he had spent his childhood before immigrating to America more than 50 years earlier. Antonio rarely used the dialect anymore. In fact, many believed he had almost forgotten it himself. The elderly businessman entered slowly, leaning only slightly on an elegant walnut cane that looked more ceremonial than necessary. Despite his age, his posture remained proud, and his sharp gray eyes carried the quiet confidence of someone who had built a family legacy long before his son built a corporate empire. Executives rose from their chairs to greet him with polished smiles and carefully practiced Italian phrases learned from travel apps and expensive vacations. Antonio thanked each of them courteously, but there was no warmth in his expression. Then, just before he reached his chair, Naomi stepped forward with a pitcher of sparkling water. She bowed her head ever so slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. Buonasera, zu Antonio. E un vero onore avere voi cca stasera. Antonio stopped instantly. His hand tightened around the cane. His eyes widened with something that looked less like surprise and more like recognition. The ballroom seemed to inhale all at once. Glasses paused halfway to waiting hands. Forks hovered above porcelain plates. Even the musicians slowed without realizing it. Antonio slowly turned toward the young waitress standing quietly beside him, studying her face as though searching through decades of forgotten memories. Then, in the very same ancient Sicilian dialect that almost no one in the room recognized, he answered with a smile no one had seen on his face in years. Ethan looked from his father to Naomi in complete disbelief. Around him, executives exchanged confused glances, realizing they were witnessing a conversation that none of their wealth, education, or influence could understand. Antonio Caldwell did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Naomi with the quiet attention of a man trying to place a familiar melody he had not heard since childhood. His weathered face softened, and another sentence flowed naturally from his lips in the old Sicilian dialect, rich with expressions that even modern Italian speakers would have struggled to recognize. Naomi answered without hesitation, her pronunciation effortless, her pace respectful, never trying to impress, only trying to honor the elderly gentleman standing before her. Around them, confusion spread faster than conversation. Investors glanced at one another, searching for someone who could explain what was happening. A European banker quietly leaned toward an Italian consultant seated nearby. "Can you understand them?" he whispered. The consultant frowned before slowly shaking his head. "Not completely. That is not standard Italian. That is something much older." Ethan Caldwell watched his father more carefully than he watched Naomi. It was the smile that unsettled him. Antonio rarely smiled during business events. Years of building companies and surviving impossible negotiations had taught him to keep every emotion carefully guarded. Yet now the corners of his eyes crinkled with genuine warmth, the kind that no public appearance, no award ceremony, and certainly no board meeting had produced in years. Naomi remained perfectly composed. She kept both hands gently folded in front of her apron, her posture humble despite becoming the center of every curious stare in the ballroom. She never raised her voice. She never looked around to see who was watching. She behaved as though speaking to Antonio was the most natural thing in the world. Antonio suddenly laughed, not loudly, but with the deep, sincere joy of someone who had unexpectedly found a forgotten piece of home thousands of miles away. The sound echoed softly beneath the crystal chandeliers, and dozens of guests turned fully toward them. The jazz musicians exchanged uncertain glances before quietly lowering the volume of their performance. Even the photographers stopped taking pictures, sensing that something far more meaningful than another executive handshake was unfolding in front of them. Ethan finally stepped closer. "Father," he asked gently, "what did she just say?" Antonio looked at his son for several long seconds before answering in English. "She did not greet me like a hotel guest. She greeted me like an old neighbor returning to the village after harvest season." Ethan blinked in surprise. Naomi lowered her eyes politely, almost hoping the attention would move elsewhere. Instead, Antonio continued studying her with quiet amazement. "Young lady," he asked, returning to the Sicilian dialect once again, "who taught you to speak like this?" Naomi inhaled softly before answering in the same gentle tone. "Someone who believed that every language carries a family inside it, and that forgetting those words means losing the people who first spoke them." Antonio closed his eyes for a brief moment. Those words landed far deeper than anyone else in the ballroom could understand. Several guests assumed they were discussing travel or culture, but Ethan noticed something different. His father's fingers tightened around the carved handle of his cane, not from weakness, but from emotion. For the first time that evening, the billionaire chief executive realized this conversation had nothing to do with business, investments, or international partnerships. Somehow, the quiet waitress whom everyone had overlooked had reached a place in his father's heart that money, influence, and decades of success had never been able to touch. No one asked the musicians to stop, yet the ballroom grew so quiet that the gentle notes of the piano seemed to fade into the distance on their own. Antonio Caldwell kept his attention on Naomi as though every familiar sound around him had suddenly become unimportant. His eyes carried the distant look of someone walking through memories instead of a luxury hotel in Midtown Manhattan. Then he spoke again in the same centuries-old Sicilian dialect, this time more slowly, using expressions filled with local proverbs and references that belonged to tiny villages tucked into the mountains overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. Several Italian guests exchanged puzzled expressions. One elderly businessman from Milan leaned closer, listening carefully before quietly admitting, "I recognize pieces of it, but I have not heard anyone speak this way in decades." Naomi smiled gently, not because she wanted attention, but because Antonio reminded her of someone she had loved dearly. She answered each phrase with remarkable patience, matching not only his words but also his rhythm, his pauses, and even the respectful forms of address that younger generations had almost completely abandoned. Antonio's eyebrows lifted higher with every response. He intentionally shifted into an even older expression, quoting a traditional Sicilian saying that celebrated humility over pride. Naomi responded with the second half of the proverb without missing a single word. A quiet gasp swept across the nearby tables. Ethan looked from his father to the guests surrounding them, noticing that no one seemed capable of following the conversation anymore. It was no longer simply another language. It felt like a private world that only two people in the ballroom could enter. Antonio smiled with unmistakable admiration. "Do you know why I chose that proverb?" he finally asked in English so that everyone could understand. Naomi answered with the same calm voice that had never risen above ordinary conversation. "Because where it comes from, people believe that respect should arrive before wealth. If someone remembered your family with kindness, they considered you richer than any merchant." Antonio slowly nodded. "Exactly. He turned toward the guests gathered around him. That saying disappeared from everyday speech before my son was even born. Every face in the room shifted toward Naomi once again. She stood exactly where she had been a few moments earlier, holding nothing more remarkable than a polished silver water pitcher. Yet somehow she had become the person everyone wanted to understand. Ethan could not hide his curiosity any longer. "Naomi," he asked carefully, "have you ever lived in Sicily?" She shook her head. "No, sir." "Did you study there?" "No, sir." The room became even quieter. One executive softly whispered, "Then how is this even possible?" Naomi lowered her eyes for a brief moment before looking back at Antonio. "Sometimes a place finds you before you ever find the place." Antonio's expression grew thoughtful. That answer carried a depth that only someone who understood loss, family, and tradition could truly appreciate. He placed one hand gently over his heart, a gesture so natural that it seemed to come from another lifetime. Ethan had seen his father negotiate billion-dollar acquisitions without showing a hint of emotion. He had watched him reject prestigious awards with polite indifference. But tonight, standing before a quiet waitress whom everyone had overlooked only minutes earlier, Antonio looked less like one of America's most respected businessmen and more like a grateful son remembering the voices that had shaped his childhood. The executives who had arrived expecting discussions about international markets now found themselves captivated by something money could never purchase. They had witnessed the beginning of a conversation that was revealing not Naomi's confidence, but her hidden history, and every passing second made the mystery surrounding her impossible to ignore. The questions did not stop. If anything, they became quieter, more deliberate, as though everyone in the ballroom suddenly understood that speaking too loudly might interrupt something unusually rare. Antonio Caldwell slowly pulled out the chair reserved for him at the head of the table, then surprised every guest by leaving it empty. Instead, he remained standing beside Naomi. The master of ceremonies glanced nervously toward Ethan, silently asking whether the formal dinner should begin. Ethan simply lifted one hand, signaling everyone to wait. Whatever had just started was clearly more important than the carefully planned schedule. Antonio looked back at Naomi with growing curiosity. "Tell me," he asked in the Sicilian dialect once again, "if someone welcomed you into their home on a rainy harvest evening, what blessing would your grandmother expect you to leave behind before you walked out the door?" Several guests assumed this was another polite greeting. It was not. The question carried layers of regional history, customs, and unwritten etiquette that had survived through generations of families rather than books. Naomi paused for only a heartbeat before answering with an old blessing that sounded almost musical, ending with a traditional phrase wishing peace upon every future meal shared beneath the same roof. Antonio lowered his head and quietly laughed to himself. "Even the blessing," he whispered, exactly the way she would have said it. Ethan had never heard those words before. Neither had the translators hired for the evening. One of them discreetly opened a translation application on his tablet before slowly lowering it again with an embarrassed smile. Technology could recognize modern Italian. It could not understand a conversation preserved through memory instead of dictionaries. Antonio continued, now asking about simple, everyday traditions. Which side of the doorway should a visitor enter first when honoring the oldest member of the household? Why did grandmothers place fresh bread on the table before serving soup? What was the meaning behind a small olive branch resting beside family photographs? Naomi answered every question with quiet confidence, never rushing, never sounding rehearsed. She spoke as though each answer carried a story instead of a definition. The executives watched in complete silence. At first, they had expected a remarkable display of language. Now they realized they were witnessing something far more valuable. Naomi was not translating vocabulary. She was preserving a way of life. Antonio gently rested both hands on the top of his cane and looked around the ballroom. "Do you know what surprises me the most?" he asked in English. No one answered. "She does not speak like someone who memorized our words. She speaks like someone who was taught why those words mattered." His voice carried neither excitement nor disbelief. It carried gratitude. Ethan noticed several guests nodding without fully understanding why they felt moved. There was something universally recognizable about seeing an older person reconnect with a treasured part of their past. Naomi remained as humble as ever. She neither smiled proudly nor accepted the admiration surrounding her. Instead, she quietly reached for the sparkling water pitcher she had been holding since the beginning of the evening. "May I refill your glass, sir?" she asked politely. Antonio looked at the crystal glass, then back at Naomi, and smiled with unmistakable affection. "You already have," he replied softly. "Not with water. With memories I thought had disappeared forever." The ballroom remained perfectly still. For the first time that evening, no one seemed interested in discussing stock prices, acquisitions, or international expansion. Every eye stayed fixed on the quiet waitress whose greatest gift was not speaking an ancient dialect, but reminding an old man that some parts of home never truly disappear as long as one heart still remembers how to say them. Naomi did not answer Antonio's last remark right away. She simply offered a modest smile before stepping back exactly as she had been trained to do, quietly making room for the evening to continue. Yet the dinner no longer belonged to the agenda printed beside every plate. It belonged to a story that no one in the ballroom could stop thinking about. Ethan noticed that every conversation had shifted toward the young waitress. Investors who had spent the previous hour discussing international mergers were now whispering about a woman whose name had not even appeared on the guest list. Antonio looked toward Ethan and spoke with calm certainty. "Son, would you mind if I asked Miss Carter one more question?" Ethan nodded immediately. "Of course." Antonio turned back to Naomi, his expression kind but thoughtful. "Forgive an old man for asking something personal," he said gently. "Where did you learn a dialect that even many families in Sicily no longer remember?" The question settled over the ballroom like the final note of a beautiful song. Naomi lowered her eyes for a brief moment before speaking. "I learned it from my grandmother," she answered softly. "She was not my grandmother by blood, but she became my family before I was old enough to understand the difference." Antonio listened without interrupting. "When I was 7 years old," Naomi continued, "my mother worked long shifts at a neighborhood bakery in Brooklyn. The apartment next door belonged to an elderly Sicilian widow named Rosa Bellini. She had no children nearby, and my mother could not always afford childcare. Mrs. Bellini offered to watch me after school, and before long, every afternoon became another lesson about kindness, tradition, and the importance of remembering where people come from." The ballroom remained perfectly still. Naomi spoke without drama, without trying to impress anyone. Her words sounded less like a remarkable story and more like simple gratitude. "Mrs. Bellini never tried to teach me a language," Naomi said with a gentle smile. "She simply lived her life. She cooked while telling stories. She sang old songs while watering her plants. She greeted every neighbor in the same dialect she had spoken since childhood. I listened every day. Eventually, I answered. Then I asked questions. She laughed whenever I made mistakes, but she always reminded me that language was never about sounding perfect. It was about making another person feel at home." Antonio slowly closed his eyes. For a moment, the years seemed to disappear from his face. "Rosa Bellini," he whispered. "That family name comes from the hills outside Cefalo." Naomi nodded respectfully. She spoke about that village almost every afternoon. She missed it every single day, even after living in America for more than 40 years. Antonio drew a slow breath. "So did I." Ethan watched the exchange with growing admiration. Suddenly, the mystery surrounding Naomi no longer felt mysterious at all. Her extraordinary gift had not come from expensive schools or exclusive language programs. It had grown from thousands of ordinary afternoons spent listening to someone who feared that her memories might disappear when she did. Antonio looked around the ballroom before speaking quietly enough that everyone leaned forward to hear him. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight you are not listening to someone who learned our dialect. You are listening to someone who protected it." No one applauded. No one reached for a camera. The silence itself became the greatest sign of respect, because everyone understood that some treasures were too meaningful to interrupt with noise. Antonio remained silent for several seconds after his own words faded into the stillness of the ballroom. Then something unexpected happened. He slowly reached into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket and removed a small leather wallet that looked far older than the expensive suit he was wearing. Its edges were worn smooth from decades of careful use. He opened it with gentle hands and pulled out a faded photograph no larger than a credit card. The colors had nearly disappeared, but the smiles remained. "This," Antonio said softly, is the last picture taken before I left Sicily. He held it carefully so Naomi could see. The image showed a stone house covered with climbing vines, an elderly woman sitting beneath an olive tree, and several children gathered around a wooden table. Naomi studied the photograph quietly. Then her eyes stopped on the elderly woman. She smiled almost immediately. She always baked almond cookies before visitors arrived, Naomi said without thinking. Antonio looked up in astonishment. How could you possibly know that? Naomi pointed gently toward the corner of the photograph. Because there is flour on the front of her apron. Mrs. Bellini used to wear hers exactly the same way whenever she baked. She said no Sicilian grandmother welcomed guests with empty hands. Antonio laughed warmly, his eyes beginning to shine. You notice details most people never see. Naomi answered with a quiet shrug. Mrs. Bellini always told me that memories hide inside ordinary things. If you pay attention, they will introduce themselves. Several guests exchanged thoughtful glances. Earlier that evening they had admired Naomi because she spoke an ancient dialect. Now they realized the language was only one small part of something much deeper. She understood the customs, the habits, the small gestures that carried generations of history without ever appearing in textbooks. Antonio carefully returned the photograph to his wallet before asking another question. This one's softer than all the others. Did Mrs. Bellini ever teach you why our elders always insisted that every meal begin with bread? Naomi smiled gently. She said bread arrived before conversation because hungry people cannot listen with peaceful hearts. Feed someone first, then speak. Antonio slowly nodded, unable to hide his emotion. That is exactly what my mother used to tell us. Ethan watched the exchange with growing admiration. Throughout his career, he had spent countless hours studying international business strategy, cultural negotiation, and executive leadership. Yet standing before him was a young waitress whose greatest lesson had come from sharing simple afternoons in a modest Brooklyn apartment with an elderly neighbor who refused to let her heritage disappear. The executives around the room no longer seemed impatient for dinner to begin. Several had quietly placed their phones face down on the table. Others leaned forward with sincere attention, listening not because they expected another astonishing display of knowledge, but because they wanted to hear the next memory. Antonio looked around the ballroom before resting his gaze once more on Naomi. There are people who inherit fortunes, he said calmly. There are people who inherit companies. But the rarest inheritance of all is receiving another family's memories and protecting them as though they were your own. No one responded. The silence itself became an acknowledgement that everyone in the room had just witnessed a kind of wealth that could never appear on a balance sheet, never be traded in a boardroom, and never be measured by numbers alone. The evening finally moved toward the dining tables, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. Every guest who had entered the Grand Astoria expecting another elegant corporate reception now found themselves quietly watching Naomi whenever she crossed the ballroom. She continued serving sparkling water, placing bread baskets on polished tables, and thanking each guest with the same calm professionalism she had shown since the beginning of her shift. Nothing about her behavior had changed. The only thing that had changed was the way everyone else looked at her. Antonio Caldwell noticed it immediately. He smiled gently before lifting his glass. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice carrying naturally across the room, "would you honor an old man with one final conversation before dinner begins?" Naomi stopped beside the table and nodded respectfully. "Of course, sir." Antonio spoke once more in the ancient Sicilian dialect, but this time his words carried a quiet challenge rather than a greeting. He recited the opening lines of an old folk tale that had been passed from grandparents to grandchildren for generations, ending halfway through the story before. Lowering his voice, several guests assumed he had forgotten the ending. Naomi did not. Without hesitation, she continued the tale exactly where Antonio had stopped. Her voice remained soft, almost gentle, but every sentence carried the rhythm of someone who had heard the story countless times beside a kitchen window while bread cooled on wooden racks and evening sunlight settled across the floor. Antonio listened without interrupting. As the final sentence faded into silence, he slowly shook his head in amazement. "That story was never written down where I grew up," he said quietly in English. "Children remembered it because their grandparents remembered it. If one generation forgot, it disappeared forever." Naomi smiled with quiet gratitude. Mrs. Bellini used to tell me that stories survive only when someone loves them enough to repeat them. Antonio rested both hands on his cane and looked around the ballroom. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I have listened to someone preserve memories that many families in Sicily have already lost. A thoughtful silence settled over the room. One investor from London finally spoke. Mr. Caldwell, I thought we were listening to an extraordinary language student. Antonio smiled kindly before shaking his head. No, language can be memorized. Culture cannot. She is not repeating vocabulary. She is carrying someone's life with dignity. Ethan felt those words more deeply than anyone realized. Throughout his career, he had invested in companies built on innovation, efficiency, and measurable results. Yet standing before him was living proof that the most valuable things people inherit often could not be measured at all. Naomi gently adjusted a place setting that had shifted slightly out of line, still focused on her responsibilities despite becoming the center of the evening. She neither accepted praise nor sought recognition. Antonio watched her for another quiet moment before speaking directly to his son. Ethan, you invited the most accomplished executives in the world to this dinner. Ethan nodded. Yes, father. Antonio smiled warmly. And yet the greatest lesson we have received tonight did not come from the stage, the boardroom, or the investment reports. It came from the young woman who reminded us that preserving another person's heritage is one of the highest forms of respect. No one reached for applause. No one attempted another conversation. The room remained peacefully still because everyone understood they had just witnessed something far greater than remarkable talent. They had witnessed humility giving forgotten memories a voice. And in that quiet moment, every title, every fortune, and every accomplishment seemed just a little smaller beside the simple grace of one waitress who never forgot another family's home. The dinner eventually resumed, but it no longer followed the carefully printed program resting beside every plate. Conversations about quarterly earnings and international expansion slowly gave way to quieter discussions about heritage, family, and the invisible threads that connect generations across oceans and decades. Ethan Caldwell noticed the difference immediately. Investors who usually competed for his attention were no longer trying to dominate the room. Instead, many watched Naomi as she continued serving each table with the same quiet professionalism she had shown since the beginning of the evening. She thanked every guest with a warm smile, refilled glasses before anyone asked, and moved through the ballroom without the slightest sign that she had become the heart of the gathering. Antonio watched her for several thoughtful moments before slowly rising from his chair. The movement drew every eye in the room. Ethan instinctively stood beside his father, expecting another toast to the company's future. Instead, Antonio picked up his glass and looked directly at Naomi. May I have everyone's attention for just 1 minute? The conversations faded instantly. Antonio smiled with gentle sincerity before speaking. I have attended dinners in Rome, London, Tokyo, Dubai, and New York. I have met presidents, inventors, artists, and business leaders whose names appear in history books. Tonight, however, I experienced something I never expected to find again. He paused, allowing the silence to settle naturally across the ballroom. When I was a little boy in Sicily, my grandmother used to tell me that one day our language would become quieter, not because people would stop loving it, but because fewer children would remember it. I thought she was wrong. Then life became busy. Families scattered. Traditions slowly faded. Tonight, this young woman reminded me that my grandmother was only half right. He turned toward Naomi, his eyes filled with unmistakable gratitude. Our language did become quieter, but it did not disappear. It simply found a new heart willing to protect it. Several guests lowered their eyes, visibly moved by the quiet honesty in his voice. Antonio continued, speaking with the steady confidence that had guided generations of his family. Miss Carter, you honored my childhood more beautifully than many people who were born where I was born. You reminded an old man that heritage is never owned by blood alone. It is carried by anyone who treats it with love and respect. Ethan felt an unexpected warmth spread through the room as guests nodded almost instinctively. Nobody seemed interested in checking a phone or whispering to a colleague anymore. Antonio slowly extended his hand toward Naomi. She hesitated only briefly before stepping forward and accepting it with both of hers, careful and respectful. There was no dramatic applause, no loud celebration, only a deep and genuine stillness that carried far more meaning than noise ever could. Ethan smiled at Naomi before speaking for the first time since the conversation had begun. "Miss Carter, I spent years believing leadership meant building successful companies. Tonight my father reminded me that true leadership also means protecting what cannot be measured on any financial statement." Naomi answered with her usual humility. "I only repeated what someone once shared with me, sir. Mrs. Bellini always believed that the greatest way to thank another culture was to treat it as carefully as your own." Antonio nodded with quiet pride. "And that," he said softly, looking around the ballroom one final time, "is why some people leave a room remembered long after every speech, every contract, and every headline has been forgotten. They remind us not of what we achieved, but of who we chose to become." The dinner came to a quiet close, but no one hurried toward the exits. The chandeliers still bathed the Grand Astoria ballroom in warm amber light. The jazz trio softly returned to its melody, and servers began clearing the last of the dinner plates. Yet something invisible had changed inside the room. Conversations that had once revolved around market forecasts and investment portfolios now carried a different weight. Guests found themselves discussing grandparents, childhood traditions, and forgotten family recipes instead of stock prices. Ethan Caldwell stood near the panoramic windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline, watching Naomi finish her responsibilities with the same quiet dedication she had shown from the very beginning. She did not linger near influential guests. She did not seek recognition or photographs. She simply completed every task with grace, thanked her co-workers, and prepared to end another ordinary shift that had unexpectedly become unforgettable. Ethan walked toward her just as she folded a clean linen napkin. "Miss Carter," he said with sincere respect, "I hope you know this evening was never about proving how much you knew. It became something much greater than that." Naomi smiled gently. "Thank you, sir. I only wanted your father to feel welcomed." Ethan looked toward Antonio, who was speaking quietly with several guests across the ballroom. "You gave him something I have not seen in years," he admitted. "You reminded him of home." Naomi nodded softly. "Sometimes home is not a place. Sometimes it is simply hearing words that tell you someone still remembers." Before Ethan could answer, Antonio slowly approached them carrying the small leather wallet that had rested in his pocket all evening. He carefully removed the faded photograph once more before placing it into Naomi's hands. "This is not a gift," he said warmly. "It is a promise." Naomi looked at him with quiet confusion. Antonio smiled. "I had planned to leave this photograph to my grandchildren one day. Tonight, I realized something important. Memories are not protected by inheritance alone. They survive because someone chooses to keep telling the story. I would like you to have a copy of it, because I know you will understand its value." Naomi accepted the photograph with both hands, her eyes shining with quiet gratitude. "I will treasure it, sir." Antonio nodded. "And every time you look at it, remember that my family considers you a friend." Around them, several guests smiled without saying a word. No contract had been signed in that moment. No business announcement had been made. Yet everyone sensed they had witnessed an agreement far more meaningful than any corporate partnership. It was an agreement built on kindness, respect, and shared humanity. As Naomi prepared to leave through the employee entrance, Antonio called after her one final time in the old Sicilian dialect. She turned, smiled, and answered with the same gentle warmth that had first stopped him in his tracks hours earlier. He placed one hand over his heart, and she quietly did the same before disappearing beyond the ballroom doors. Ethan watched until she was gone, then looked at his father. Antonio spoke with the peaceful certainty of a man who had finally found something he thought history had taken away forever. "Money builds buildings," he said softly. "Power opens doors, but respect keeps memories alive." Ethan looked across the now quiet ballroom and understood that the most valuable lesson of the evening had never appeared on the schedule. It arrived through the humble voice of a young waitress who asked for nothing, expected nothing, and still managed to leave behind something priceless. Because true wealth is never measured by what we own. It is measured by what we choose to preserve for the people who come after us.